At 2306 hours on February 28, 1942, Captain Hector Waller stood on the bridge of HMAS Perth as his ship entered Sunda Strait, the narrow passage between Java and Sumatra. Behind him, USS Houston followed at 1,000 yards distance. Both ships were heading northwest toward the open Indian Ocean, attempting to escape the Japanese forces that had been systematically conquering the Dutch East Indies for the past 2 months. Intelligence reports suggested the strait was clear of enemy forces. A night transit would bring the 2 cruisers to safety by dawn. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. At 23:15 hours, lookouts spotted ships ahead, many ships, their silhouettes black against the tropical night. Waller raised his binoculars and counted destroyers, transports, cruisers, more ships than he could accurately tally in the darkness. This was not a patrol. This was an invasion fleet the Japanese forces assembled to land troops at Bantam Bay on Java's western coast, and Perth and Houston had sailed directly into the middle of it. Waller had seconds to make a decision. Turn back toward Java and face certain interception by Japanese forces behind them, or continue forward through the invasion fleet, fighting their way through whatever the Japanese could throw at them. Neither option offered realistic hope of survival, but turning back guaranteed death. Going forward offered a slim chance, and it offered something else, the opportunity to inflict maximum damage on a Japanese invasion force that was about to capture the last Allied stronghold in the East Indies. At 2316 hours, Waller gave the order that would seal his ship's fate and immortalize her crew's courage. Open fire. All guns, engage the nearest targets. Perth's forward turrets rotated toward the closest destroyer and fired. The battle that would become known as the Battle of Sunda Strait had begun. It would last 4 hours. It would end with both Allied cruisers on the bottom of the strait and over 1,000 Allied sailors dead. But before they died, Perth and Houston would fight one of the most desperate and heroic naval actions in history, charging directly into a Japanese fleet, dozens of ships, strong firing until their ammunition was exhausted, refusing to surrender, choosing to die fighting rather than accepting inevitable defeat. HMAS Perth was a modified Leander-class light cruiser built by HMA Naval Dockyard at Williamstown, Victoria, and commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy on July 29, 1936. She displaced 105 tons, standard measured 562 feet long, and could make 32.5 knots at full power. Her main armament consisted of 8 6-inch Mark 33 guns and 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. Secondary armament included 8 4-inch anti-aircraft guns in 4 twin mounts, multiple smaller weapons, and 8 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quadruple mounts. The ship was modern, well-armed, and professionally crewed. Her crew of approximately 680 officers and men represented the best the Royal Australian Navy could field. Experienced career sailors, eager volunteers, young men drawn from every corner of Australia who had joined the Navy to serve their country in what everyone knew was coming war. Captain Hector MacDonald, Laws Waller, commanded Perth. He was 42 years old in February 1942, a career naval officer who had graduated from the Royal Australian Naval College in 1913. Waller had served in World War I aboard the battlecruiser HMS New Zealand, seeing action at Jutland. Between the wars, he had commanded destroyers and attended the Royal Navy Staff College. He was known throughout the RAN as a fighting captain, aggressive and competent, exactly the kind of officer you wanted commanding your ship in combat. When war erupted in the Pacific on December 7, 1941, Perth was operating in the Mediterranean supporting British operations against Italy. In January 1942, with Japan advancing through Southeast Asia, Perth was urgently recalled to the Pacific. She transited the Suez Canal, crossed the Indian Ocean, and arrived at Darwin, Australia on February 4, 1942. 2 weeks later, She sailed north to join the ABDA American, British, Dutch, Australian naval force, attempting to defend the Dutch East Indies against Japanese invasion. The strategic situation was desperate. In 2 months, Japanese forces had captured Hong Kong, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, British Borneo, and much of the Dutch East Indies. Now they were converging on Java, the last significant Allied position in Southeast Asia. If Java fell, Australia would be directly threatened. The ABDA command had been formed to coordinate Allied defense, but coordination was nearly impossible. American, British, Dutch, and Australian forces spoke different languages, used different equipment, operated under different tactical doctrines, and had never trained together. HMAS Perth joined this makeshift force on February 14, 1942, at Tanjung Priok, the port serving Batavia, now Jakarta. She became part of the ABDA striking force under Dutch Rear Admiral Karl Doorman. The force included the Dutch light cruisers De Ruyter and Java, the British heavy cruiser, HMS Exeter, the Australian light cruiser, Perth, the American heavy cruiser, USS Houston, and 9 destroyers of various nationalities. USS Houston was a Northampton-class heavy cruiser mounting 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets. She had been damaged at the Battle of Darwin on February 4th when Japanese aircraft attacked the port. A bomb had destroyed Houston's aft turret, killing 60 men and reducing her main armament to 6 8-inch guns in 2 turrets. Houston had sailed with the ABDA force despite her damage because every ship was desperately needed. On February 27, 1942, Admiral Doorman led his strike force to intercept a Japanese invasion convoy heading for Java. The resulting Battle of the Java Sea was a disaster. Doorman's force encountered a Japanese covering force of 4 cruisers and 14 destroyers. In 5 hours of confused fighting, the Japanese sank De Ruyter Java and the destroyer HMS Electra and damaged HMS Exeter. Admiral Doorman died when De Ruyter was torpedoed and sank. Over 900 Allied sailors were killed. The Japanese suffered minimal damage. Perth and Houston survived the battle by withdrawing south when the situation became untenable. They reached Tanjung Priok on the evening of February 27th, refueled, and prepared to sail again. The situation was clear: Java was doomed. Japanese forces would land within days. Any Allied ships remaining in Java's waters would be trapped and destroyed. The order came to evacuate remaining Allied vessels to Australia via Sunda Strait, the narrow passage between Java and Sumatra that opened to the Indian Ocean. At 1900 hours on February 28, Perth and Houston departed Tanjung Priok and steamed west at 20 knots toward Sunda Strait. The 2 ships were alone: no destroyer escort, no air cover, no support. Intelligence indicated Sunda Strait was clear of Japanese forces. The ships would transit the strait during darkness and be in the open Indian Ocean by dawn, where they could make maximum speed toward Australia. Captain Waller knew the intelligence was questionable. Japanese forces controlled the air and sea approaches to Java. The likelihood that Sunda Strait was actually clear seemed optimistic, but there was no alternative. The other escape route around the eastern end of Java was certainly blocked by Japanese forces. Sunda Strait offered at least a possibility of escape. Waller ordered his crew to action stations as Perth approached the strait. Every gun was manned ammunition, ready lookouts scanning the darkness. At 2306 hours, Perth entered Sunda Strait from the south. The strait was approximately 16 miles wide at this point, with Java on the left and Sumatra on the right. The night was dark, no moon, visibility poor. Captain Waller stood on the bridge, binoculars raised, searching the darkness ahead. Houston followed 1,000 yards astern, Captain Albert Rooks commanding. The 2 ships communicated by signal lamp, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. At 2315 hours, the situation changed catastrophically. Lookouts spotted multiple ships ahead, their silhouettes visible against the northern horizon. Waller counted quickly: two columns of transports destroyer escorts visible on the flanks, possibly cruisers further out. The transports were anchored or moving slowly. This was not a transit force. This was an invasion fleet preparing to land troops. Waller immediately signaled Houston, "Enemy transports ahead." Captain Rooks acknowledged. Both cruisers increased speed to 28 knots and prepared for action. Neither captain hesitated or considered retreat. They were professional naval officers confronting an enemy invasion force. Their duty was clear attack, inflict maximum damage, disrupt the invasion if possible. That both ships would likely be destroyed in the process was irrelevant. This was what they had trained for, what they existed to do. What neither Waller nor Rooks knew was the size of the force they were attacking. The Japanese Western Java invasion force consisted of 56 transports carrying approximately 20,000 troops, escorted by one light cruiser, 8 destroyers, 2 submarine chasers, 2 mine layers, and several patrol boats. Supporting the invasion fleet were 2 heavy cruisers and 3 destroyers from the Japanese Third Fleet. In total, over 60 Japanese vessels were concentrated in and around Bantam Bay. Perth and Houston were about to engage forces outnumbering them 30-1 in confined waters that prevented maneuver with no possibility of reinforcement or escape. Any rational calculation suggested immediate destruction. But rational calculation has limited application when professional naval officers encounter enemy forces threatening to invade territory they are sworn to defend. At 2316 hours, Perth's forward turrets opened fire on the nearest destroyer at a range of approximately 8,000 yards. The 6-inch shells crossed the darkness in less than 10 seconds and bracketed the Japanese vessel. The destroyer Fubuki returned fire and launched torpedoes. Perth increased speed and began maneuvering her after turrets firing as the forward turrets reloaded. Houston opened fire seconds later, her 2 remaining 8-inch turrets targeting a transport anchored in Bantam Bay. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. Destroyers throughout the invasion fleet launched torpedoes and opened fire with guns. The cruisers Mogami and Makuma, positioned northwest of Bantam Bay, detected the gunfire and steamed toward the action at high speed. Within minutes, Perth and Houston were under fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Waller maneuvered Perth through the Japanese formation at maximum speed, firing at every target that appeared. The cruiser's 4 turrets maintained continuous fire, the 6-inch guns firing as fast as crews could load them. The rate of fire was approximately 8 rounds per minute per gun under ideal conditions. In combat with the ship maneuvering violently and enemy shells landing around her, the actual rate was perhaps 5 rounds per minute. Still, Perth was putting approximately 160 rounds per minute into the Japanese formation, a devastating volume of fire. Targets were everywhere. Perth's gunners had no shortage of ships to shoot at. They engaged destroyers at close range, fired at transports anchored in the bay, targeted cruisers approaching from the northwest. Fire control systems worked perfectly, tracking targets, calculating firing solutions, guiding the turrets. Shells hit Japanese vessels with regularity. Destroyers were damaged. Transports caught fire. One transport, the Ryujo Maru, was hit multiple times and began sinking, carrying troops who had not yet disembarked. But for every target Perth hit, 5 more appeared. Japanese destroyers were launching torpedoes from multiple directions. The water around Perth and Houston filled with torpedo tracks, the deadly weapons running just below the surface at 40 knots, impossible to see in darkness until they were too close to avoid. At 23:35, approximately 20 minutes into the engagement, the first torpedo hit Perth on the port side forward. The explosion flooded several compartments and reduced speed. Waller ordered damage control parties to contain the flooding while maintaining maximum possible speed. Perth's guns never stopped firing. Houston was firing continuously as well, her two 8-inch turrets targeting the largest ships visible. The heavier shells from Houston's guns could penetrate cruiser armor and cause catastrophic damage to transports. Captain Rooks positioned Houston to support Perth, following the Australian cruiser through the Japanese formation, firing at targets Perth's guns could not engage. The Japanese commanders were initially confused by the Allied attack. The invasion fleet had expected no resistance. Allied naval forces were believed to have been destroyed at the Java Sea. The appearance of two cruisers attacking the invasion fleet at night was completely unexpected. The confusion gave Perth and Houston perhaps 15 minutes where Japanese response was disorganized and ineffective. But as Japanese commanders realized what was happening, their response became coordinated and deadly. The heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma arrived from the northwest at high speed, their powerful 8-inch guns engaging Perth and Houston at ranges under 10,000 yards. Destroyers positioned themselves to launch torpedoes from multiple bearings simultaneously. The Japanese had overwhelming numbers and were beginning to use them effectively. At 23:48, Perth suffered 2 more torpedo hits on the port side amidships. The explosions destroyed boiler rooms and flooded engine spaces. Speed dropped to 15 knots. The ship began listing to port. Waller ordered counterflooding to correct the list and continued engaging targets. Perth's ammunition was running low. The forward magazines had perhaps 20% of their initial load remaining. The aft magazines were nearly empty. Waller faced the final calculation every naval commander dreads. He could order abandon ship now while his crew still had time to get off in relatively good order. Or he could continue fighting until ammunition was completely exhausted, knowing that additional time meant more men would die when the ship finally went down. Waller's decision took perhaps 3 seconds. Perth would fight until the ammunition was gone. Every shell fired into the Japanese fleet was one less shell they could use against Allied forces elsewhere. Every minute Perth kept Japanese attention focused on her was 1 minute Japanese forces were not landing troops on Java. At 00:05 hours on March 1, 1942, Perth fired her last 6-inch shell. The forward magazines were empty. The aft magazines were empty. The ready ammunition beside each gun had been expended. Perth's main battery was silent for the first time in over 90 minutes of continuous combat. The ship had fired approximately 1,400 rounds of 6-inch ammunition, roughly 80% of her total load. She had hit multiple Japanese vessels, sunk at least 1 transport, damaged several destroyers, and disrupted the invasion landing for hours. But now she was defenseless. Japanese destroyers closed in firing at point-blank range. Shells tore through Perth's thin armor, killing men and starting fires. A 4th torpedo hit the starboard side, causing catastrophic flooding. The list to port increased to 30 degrees. Waller knew his ship was finished. He gave the order he had hoped never to give: abandon ship. All hands abandon ship. The crew began going over the side into the dark water of Sunda Strait. Many were wounded. Some were trapped below decks as compartments flooded. Others went into the water and were never seen again, lost in the darkness, swept away by currents, or killed by continued Japanese firing. Captain Waller remained on the bridge as his ship went down. He was last seen standing at his post as Perth rolled over and sank at 00:25 hours on March 1, 1942. Houston continued fighting. Captain Rooks had watched Perth die while continuing to engage Japanese forces with his 2 operational turrets. Houston's situation was even more desperate than Perth's had been. She had entered the engagement with reduced armament due to the Darwin bomb damage. She was now alone, surrounded by Japanese vessels with no possibility of escape. At 00:30 hours, Houston's aft turret ran out of ammunition. At 00:33, the forward turret fired its last shell. Like Perth, Houston had fought until she had nothing left to fire. And like Perth, she now faced destruction with no ability to defend herself. Japanese destroyers closed in and fired torpedoes at ranges under 1,000 yards. 3 torpedoes hit Houston almost simultaneously. The explosions tore the cruiser apart. She rolled over and sank at 00:45 hours on March 3, 1942. Captain Rooks died on his bridge, refusing to abandon ship while any of his crew remained aboard. The Battle of Sunda Strait was over. It had lasted 4 hours. 2 Allied cruisers had engaged a Japanese invasion fleet of over 60 ships. They had inflicted significant damage, sunk at least 1 transport, and possibly 2 damaged multiple destroyers, killed hundreds of Japanese sailors and soldiers. They had disrupted the invasion landing by several hours, and they had demonstrated that Allied naval forces, though outnumbered and outgunned, would fight to the death rather than surrender or retreat. The cost was devastating. HMAS Perth lost approximately 353 men killed, including Captain Waller. 328 survivors reached the water and were picked up by Japanese vessels over the following days. They spent the rest of the war as prisoners of war, many dying in Japanese captivity from disease, malnutrition, and brutal treatment. Only 218 Perth crew members survived to return home after the war ended. USS Houston lost approximately 700 men killed. 368 survivors were rescued by Japanese forces and became prisoners of war. Many died in captivity, particularly those forced to work on the Burma-Thailand Railway, the brutal construction project that killed thousands of Allied prisoners. 291 Houston crew members survived to return home. Japanese losses in the Battle of Sunda Strait are disputed. Japanese records indicate 1 transport sunk, possibly 2, and several vessels damaged. Casualties among the invasion force were described as moderate ramorin, which typically meant several hundred killed or wounded. The Japanese achieved their objective, landing their invasion force on Java despite the Allied attack. But the landing was delayed, disorganized, and more costly than planned. The strategic impact of the battle was nil. Java fell to Japanese forces within a week. The Dutch East Indies were completely conquered by March 9, 1942. Allied forces withdrew to Australia and India. The Japanese established control over Southeast Asia that would last until 1945. Perth and Houston's sacrifice did not change the outcome of the campaign or slow the Japanese advance by any meaningful duration. But the symbolic impact was profound. Perth and Houston demonstrated that Allied forces would fight even when defeat was certain. They showed Japanese forces that conquering Southeast Asia would cost blood, that Allied sailors would not surrender easily, that every Japanese advance would be contested. This was important for morale in Australia and America, where news of constant defeats had created fear that Japanese forces were invincible. Perth's loss was particularly devastating for Australia. She was the Royal Australian Navy's most modern cruiser, a symbol of Australia's naval power and independence. Her destruction, along with the loss of over 350 Australian sailors, struck at national pride and confidence. But the manner of her loss, fighting overwhelming odds rather than retreating or surrendering, became a source of pride that overshadowed the grief. Captain Hector Waller became a national hero. His decision to attack the Japanese invasion fleet rather than attempt to escape was celebrated as the epitome of naval courage and professionalism. Waller was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Order. A memorial was erected in his honor at the Royal Australian Naval College. His name became synonymous with Australian naval tradition and fighting spirit. The survivors of Perth, who spent 3.5 years as prisoners of war, faced unimaginable hardship. Japanese treatment of prisoners was brutal, characterized by inadequate food, non-existent medical care, forced labor, and routine beatings. Many Perth survivors were forced to work on the Burma-Thailand Railway, where conditions were so horrific that approximately 13,000 Allied prisoners and over 100,000 Asian laborers died during construction. One survivor, ordinary seaman, Raymond Parkin, kept a secret diary throughout his captivity, documenting conditions and events despite the certainty of execution if discovered. Parkin survived the war and published his diary as Out of the Smoke, providing one of the most detailed accounts of the Perth's loss and subsequent prisoner experience. Another survivor, Lieutenant Commander Eric Nave, returned to Australia after the war and provided detailed accounts of the battle for official naval histories. His descriptions of Captain Waller's command decisions and the crew's fighting spirit became the basis for understanding what happened in Sunda Strait during those final hours. The wreck of HMAS Perth was located in 2004 by recreational divers in approximately 100 feet of water in Sunda Strait. The ship lies on her port side largely intact, despite 62 years underwater. The wreck is designated a war grave and is protected under Australian law. Diving is prohibited without special permission. The location has been marked and is monitored to prevent unauthorized disturbance. USS Houston's wreck was located in the same area. Like Perth, she lies in relatively shallow water and is designated a war grave. Both wrecks have suffered from unauthorized salvage operations over the years, with metal being illegally removed for scrap. This desecration of war graves has led to increased security and international agreements to protect the sites. In Australia, Perth is remembered through memorials, museums, and annual commemorations. The Perth Memorial on Garden Island in Sydney lists the names of all crew members lost. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra displays artifacts from Perth, including the ship's bell recovered from the wreck. Every year on March 1st, memorial services are held to honor Perth's crew and all Australian sailors lost in World War II. The Battle of Sunda Strait is studied at naval academies as an example of how small forces can fight against overwhelming odds. The tactical lessons are debated. Should Waller have attempted to withdraw when he first spotted the invasion fleet? Could Perth and Houston have escaped if they had turned back immediately? Would a different approach have achieved better results? Most military historians conclude that Waller made the only decision consistent with his duty and training. Naval officers do not retreat when encountering enemy invasion forces. They attack. The outcome was predetermined by the forces involved, but the decision to fight was correct regardless of outcome. This principle that duty requires action, even when success is impossible, is central to naval tradition worldwide. Perth's story resonates because it exemplifies this principle. The ship and her crew did not die in a confused melee or through tactical error. They died doing exactly what they were supposed to do, engaging the enemy, fighting until ammunition was exhausted, refusing to surrender. That they were overwhelmingly outnumbered does not diminish their achievement. If anything, it enhances it. Fighting when victory is possible requires courage. Fighting when defeat is certain requires something beyond courage. It requires absolute commitment to duty and unwillingness to accept that survival is more important than mission accomplishment. Modern Australian naval vessels continue to commemorate Perth. HMAS Perth III, an Adelaide-class guided missile frigate commissioned in 2006, carries the battle honors of her predecessor. The ship's company maintains traditions established by the original Perth's crew. The ship's bell from Perth Vafreen is displayed prominently aboard Perth III as a reminder of the legacy they inherit. The story of HMAS Perth and USS Houston has been told in books, documentaries, and films. The most comprehensive account is The Ship That Wouldn't Die by William L. McGee, which details Houston's service and loss. Australian author Ross Pearson wrote The Last Cruise of HMAS Perth, providing detailed analysis of the battle and survivor experiences. These works ensure that the story remains known to new generations. For Australia, Perth's loss represented something more than a military defeat. It represented the end of the illusion that Australia was protected by distance from major wars. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 had shattered the belief that British forces would protect Australia. Perth's destruction in early March demonstrated that Australian forces fighting alongside allies could not stop Japanese advances. Australia faced the real possibility of invasion, and only American intervention would prevent it. This realization transformed Australian strategic thinking. The country committed fully to total war, mobilizing its economy and population for defense. Australian forces fought in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually New Guinea, where they stopped Japanese advances toward Port Moresby and began the long campaign to push Japanese forces back. Perth's sacrifice was part of the crucible that forged modern Australian military identity and strategic independence. The survivors who returned from Japanese captivity after the war faced another battle, reintegrating into civilian life after years of trauma. Many struggled with physical disabilities from disease and malnutrition. Others suffered psychological wounds that would not be diagnosed or treated adequately for decades. Some never spoke about their experiences, the memories too painful to revisit. Others became advocates for proper recognition and compensation for former prisoners of war. The last survivor of HMAS Perth, Arthur Bancroft, died in 2017 at age 94. With his death, the direct link to the ship and her final battle was severed. But the story lives on through memorial services, historical records, preserved artifacts, and the continuing tradition of the Royal Australian Navy. Perth's battle honors are recited at naval ceremonies. Her story is taught to naval cadets. Her example inspires Australian sailors serving today. The Battle of Sunda Strait lasted 4 hours on a dark night in February 1942. 2 cruisers fought 60 ships and lost. Over 1,000 men died. The battle changed nothing strategically, but everything symbolically. It demonstrated that courage does not require victory, that duty transcends survival, that fighting when defeat is certain can be more important than winning when success is possible. HMAS Perth went down fighting in Sunda Strait, her guns firing until ammunition was exhausted, her captain on the bridge, her crew at their posts. She stands as a memorial to all sailors who have fought hopeless battles because duty required it, who have faced overwhelming odds because honor demanded it, who have chosen death with dignity over survival with shame. The ship that stood up to the Japanese was destroyed in 4 hours, but her legacy endures, a testament to the courage of ordinary men doing extraordinary things when their country needed them most.